This, too, is a classic. A thundering calliope of raindropped words pounding against our consciousness, compelling us to be new and better people. That can only be achieved by a classic. A bubbling up of untamed desire and raw feeling from the depths of our being. That, too, must be the function of classic literature. To reshape the heart, mind, and spirit of all, moving us on to greater heights of understanding, is also well within the power of the classics. Here we first imagine, then create, and finally pass on the very best of the literary realm from both then and now. This is our only mandate. So we welcome you, one and all, young and old, schooled and enterprising, to the wonderful world of literature's greatest triumphs and word portraits from the ever-changing, always engaging human spirit. This is classic literature. When heaven meets earth, when people strive for greater understanding, when myth and legend are understood to be real and life-changing, when people become materially exhausted, unrequited, hopeless and isolated within themselves, at that darkest hour blossoms the flower of innate spirituality. As we ride in this soul car of the material body, it is to be understood that we are so much more than this clockwork combination of earth, water, fire, air, and ether in which we travel through time and space. While admittedly an exquisite machine, the material body is limited by the ever-present, seemingly unconquerable scourges of birth, death, disease, and old age upon the wandering, hungry soul. When one truly understands that they are not this body, but instead reside temporarily within its manifest combination of elements, only to expand their evolutionary jurisdiction and intimate understanding, then blossoms the flower of innate spirituality. When knowledge arises that mortal man is in fact an eternal spiritual qualitative spark of the unlimited divine fire of God, and that there is from the very first moment of time struck a long and loving relationship between the Creator and the created, then surely blossoms the flower of innate spirituality. Here is the opportunity, and now is the hour, to dive deeper than we have ever done into the wondrous realm of the ever-expanding field of divine consciousness. A singular chance to understand and embrace our real birthright of Sat, Chit, Ananda, or eternity, knowledge, and bliss ever-increasing and everlasting. It has long been said that sound vibration is a bridge between heaven and earth, and to marry that power to the wisdom of the ages is perhaps the strongest connection made between mortal man and the gods above us. Welcome, then, brothers and sisters, to a unique collection of ancient but also inspired contemporary thought on the true nature of our existence here within this wondrous material realm and beyond. This is your ticket to transcendence, a singular opportunity to fly free, soaring to places unknown but deeply felt, a means of intimate connection and liberating power. This is the Yoga Secrets Series. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is an ancient funerary text written on papyrus and used from the beginning of the New Kingdom around 1550 BCE to around 50 BCE. The original Egyptian name for the text is translated as Book Coming Forth by Day or Book of Emerging Forth into the Light. The Book of the Dead, which was placed in the coffin or burial chamber of the deceased, was part of the tradition of the funerary texts, which includes the earlier pyramid texts and coffin texts, which were painted onto objects and not written. Some of the spells included in the book were drawn from these older works and date to the 3rd millennium BCE. There was no single Book of the Dead. The surviving texts contain a varying selection of religious and magical texts and vary considerably in their illustration. Some people seem to have commissioned their own copies of the Book of the Dead, perhaps choosing the spells they thought most vital in their own progression to the afterlife. The Book of the Dead was most commonly written in hieroglyphic script on papyrus and often illustrated with vignettes depicting the deceased and their journey into the afterlife. The book first developed in Thebes towards the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period, around 1700 BCE. By the 17th dynasty, the Book of the Dead had become widespread, not only for members of the royal family, but courtiers and other officials as well. At this stage, the spells were typically inscribed on linen shrouds wrapped around the dead, though occasionally they were found written on coffins or on papyrus. During the 25th and 26th dynasties, the Book of the Dead was updated, revised, and standardized. Spells were ordered and numbered consistently for the first time. This standardized version is known today as the Site Recension, after the site, the 26th destiny. One aspect of death was the disintegration of the various kipiru, or modes of existence. Funeral rituals served to reintegrate these different aspects of being. Mummification served to preserve and transform the physical body into Sa, an idealized form with divine aspects. The Book of the Dead contained spells aimed at preserving the body of the deceased, which may have been recited during the process of mummification. The heart, which was regarded as the aspect of being which included intelligence and memory, was also protected with spells. And in case anything happened to the physical heart, it was common to bury jeweled heart scarabs with a body to provide a replacement. The Ka, or life force, remained in the tomb with the dead body and required sustenance with offerings of food, water, and incense. In case priests or relatives failed to provide these offerings, spell 105 ensured the Ka was satisfied. The name of the dead person, which constituted their individuality and was required for their continued existence, was written in many places throughout the book. And thus spell 25 ensured the deceased would remember their own name. The Ba was a free-ranging spirit aspect of the deceased. It was the Ba, depicted as a human-headed bird, which could go forth by day from the tomb into the world. Spells 61 and 89 acted to preserve it. Finally, the Shut or shadow of the deceased was preserved by spells 91, 92, and 188. If all these aspects of the person could be variously preserved, remembered, and satiated, then the dead person would live on in the form of an Ankh. An Ankh was a blessed spirit with magical powers who would dwell amongst the gods. The nature of the afterlife which the dead people enjoyed is difficult to define because of the differing traditions within the ancient Egyptian religion. In the Book of the dead were taken into the presence of the god Osiris, who was confined to the subterranean Duat. There are also spells to enable the Ba, or Ankh of the dead, to join Ra as he traveled the sky in his sun Baroque. As well as joining the gods, the Book of the Dead also depicts the dead living in the Field of Reeds, a paradise-like vision of the real world. The Field of Reeds is depicted as a lush, plentiful version of the Egyptian way of living. There are fields, crops, oxen, people, and waterways. The deceased person is shown encountering the great Enid, a group of gods, as well as his or her own parents. While the depiction of the Field of Reeds is pleasant and plentiful, it is also clear that manual labor is required. For this reason, burials included a number of statuettes called Shapti, or later Ushapti. These statuettes were inscribed with a spell, also included in the Book of the Dead, requiring them to undertake any manual labor that might be the owner's duty in the afterlife. It is also clear that the dead not only went to a place where the gods lived, but that they acquired divine characteristics themselves. In many occasions, the deceased is mentioned as the Osiris in the Book of the Dead. The path to the afterlife, as laid out in the Book of the Dead, was a difficult one. The deceased was required to pass a series of gates, caverns, and mounds, guarded by supernatural entities. These terrifying creatures were armed with enormous knives and are illustrated in grotesque forms, typically as human figures, with the heads of animals or combinations of different ferocious beasts. Their names, for instance, he who lives on snakes, or he who dances in blood, are equally grotesque. These creatures had to be pacified by reciting the appropriate spells included in the Book of the Dead. Once pacified, they posed no further threat, and could even extend their protection to the dead person. Another breed of supernatural creatures were slaughterers, who killed the unrighteous on behalf of Osiris. The Book of the Dead equipped its owner to escape their attentions. As well as these supernatural entities, there were also threats from natural or supernatural animals, including crocodiles, snakes, and beetles. If all the obstacles of the Duat could be negotiated, the deceased would be judged in the weighing of the heart ritual, depicted in spell 125. The deceased was led by the god Anubis into the presence of Osiris. There the dead person swore that he had not committed any sin from a list of 42 sins, reciting a text known as the negative confession. Then the dead person's heart was weighed on a pair of scales against the goddess Mot, who embodied truth and justice. Mot was often represented by an ostrich feather, the hieroglyphic sign for her name. At this point, there was a risk that the deceased's heart would bear witness, owing up to sins committed in life. Spell 30b guarded against this eventuality. If the scales balanced, this meant that the deceased had led a good life. Anubis would take them to Osiris, and they would find their place in the afterlife, becoming Ma Kiru, meaning vindicated, or true of voice. However, if the heart was out of balance with Mot, then another fearsome beast, called Amit, the Devourer, stood ready to eat it and put the dead person's afterlife to an early and unpleasant end. This scene is remarkable not only for its vividness, but as one of the few parts of the Book of the Dead with any explicit moral content. The judgment of the dead and the negative confession were a representation of the conventional moral code which governed Egyptian society. For every "I have not" in the negative confession, it is possible to read an unexpressed "Thou shalt not." While the 10 Commandments of Jewish and Christian ethics are rules of conduct laid down by a perceived divine revelation, the negative confession is more a divine enforcement of everyday morality. Views differ among Egyptologists about how far the negative confession represents a moral absolute, with ethical purity being necessary for progress to the afterlife. A Book of the Dead was produced to order by scribes. They were commissioned by people in preparation for their own funerals, or by relatives of someone recently deceased. They were expensive items. One source gives the price of a Book of the Dead scroll as 1 deben of silver, perhaps half the annual pay of a common laborer. Papyrus itself was evidently costly, as there are many instances of its reuse in everyday documents. In one case that we know about, a Book of the Dead was written on second-hand papyrus. Most owners of the Book of the Dead were evidently part of the social elite. They were initially reserved for the royal family, but later are found in the tombs of scribes, priests, and other officials. Most owners were men, and generally the illustrations included the owner's wife as well. Towards the beginning of the history of the Book of the Dead, there are roughly 10 copies belonging to men for every 1 for a woman. However, during the third intermediate period, 2 were for women and every 1 for a man. The dimensions of the Book of the Dead could vary widely. The longest is 40 meters long, while some are as short as 1 meter. They are composed of sheets of papyrus joined together, the individual sections varying in width from 15 centimeters to 45 centimeters. The scribes working on a Book of the Dead papyrus took more care over their work than those working on more mundane tasks. Care was taken to frame the text within margins and to avoid writing on the joints between the sheets. Books were often prefabricated in workshops, with spaces being left for the name of the deceased to be written in later. For instance, in the Papyrus of Ani, the name Ani appears at the top or bottom of a column, or immediately following a rubric introducing him as the speaker of a block of text. The name appears in a different handwriting to the rest of the manuscript, and in some places it is spelled incorrectly or omitted altogether. The text of a New Kingdom Book of the Dead was typically written in cursive hieroglyphs, most often from left to right, but also sometimes from right to left. The hieroglyphs were in columns, which were separated by black lines, a similar arrangement of that used when hieroglyphs were carved on tomb walls or monuments. Illustrations were put in frames above, below, or between the columns of text. The largest illustrations took up to a full page of papyrus. The text of a Book of the Dead was written in both black and red ink, regardless whether it was a hieroglyphic or hieratic script. Most of the text was in black, with red ink used for the titles of spells, opening and closing sections of spells, and the instructions to perform spells correctly in rituals, and also the names of dangerous creatures, such as the demon Ep. The black ink used was based upon carbon, and the red on ochre, in both cases mixed with water. The style and nature of the vignettes used to illustrate a Book of the Dead varies widely. Some contain lavish color illustrations, even making use of gold leaf. Others contain only line drawings, or simple illustrations at the opening. Book of the Dead papyri were often the work of several different scribes and artists, whose work was literally pasted together. It is usually possible to identify the style of more than one scribe used on a given manuscript, even when the manuscript is a shorter one.